DiMario.
Here.
Senator Archambault. Senator Coyne.
Here.
Senator Coleman.
Here.
Senator Miller. Senator Rogers.
Here.
Senator Valverde.
Here.
Madam Chair, there are 7 present. We have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk.
Also just joined Senator Miller.
Senator Miller, thank you. Senator Miller is present. The first 2 bills we have in front of us tonight are scheduled for consideration. These 2 pieces of legislation have passed the Senate in previous years. That's Senate Bill 37 and Senate Bill 155. And with that, I would like to be able to pass these onto the floor with the recommendation of this committee. And so with that being said, I would like to entertain a motion to pass Senate Bill 37, moved by Senator Coleman, seconded by Senator DiMario and Senator Valverde and Senator Coyne. And Mr. Clerk, could you please take a roll?
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Senator DiMario.
Yes.
Senator Coyne.
Yes.
Senator Coleman.
Yes.
Senator Miller. Senator Rogers.
Yes.
Senator Valverde.
Yes.
Madam Chair, there are 7 in the affirmative and 0 in the negative.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. And the next bill slated for consideration is Senate Bill 155 by Leader McCaffrey, and I would entertain a motion for its passage. And Senator Valverde moves passage, seconded by Senator Coleman and Senator DiMario, Senator Coyne. And Mr. Clerk, would you please take the roll?
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Senator DiMario.
Yes.
Senator Archambault. Senator Coyne.
Yes.
Senator Coleman.
Yes.
Senator Miller. Senator Rogers.
Yes.
Senator Valverde.
Yes.
Madam Chair, there are 7 in the affirmative and 0 in the negative.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. And we have 3 bills for hearing tonight. That's Senate Bill 105, Senate Bill 473, Senate Bill 703. These bills are all coming before this committee for the first time. And as has been our practice, I would like to entertain a motion to hold these bills for further study. And so moved by Senator Coyne, seconded by Senator DiMario and Senator Coleman. And Mr. Clerk, could you please take a roll?
Madam Chair.
Yes.
Senator DiMario.
Yes.
Senator Archambault. Senator Coyne.
Yes.
Senator Coleman.
Yes.
Senator Miller. Senator Rogers. Senator Valverde.
Yes.
Madam Chair, there are 7 in the affirmative and 0 in the negative.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. And next, we will do as we have done in the past. We will let the sponsors of the bills scheduled to be heard give an explanation of their bills, and then we will move on to public comment. And so with that being said, the first bill before us is Senate Bill 105. And this is my legislation, the Environmental Justice Act, Rhode Island's Environmental Justice Act. So this is one of the first bills that I introduced in this term. I actually introduced it alongside with the Act on Climate legislation. And my intention in this legislation is to make sure that the state has a definition for environmental justice that we can have embedded in our state laws. And so really, this is important because what we see happening is that certain environmental burdens do fall disproportionately on some communities and not on others. And so environmental justice considerations are incredibly important to make sure that we are accounting for those additional burdens in communities with our permitting considerations, that we're taking, and taking those the issues that come from like polluting facilities are taken into consideration with future siting. So in addition to creating a definition for for environmental justice, which mirrors the federal definition of environmental justice, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, English language proficiency, or income regarding the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This bill basically requires the Department of Environmental Management to adopt a list of environmental justice focus areas within the state, and it also requires municipalities to designate a representative for the environmental justice focus groups after consulting with community groups. It's really intended to bring community and neighborhood perspective to the environmental justice conversation. The Department of Environmental Management under this bill shall not grant permits for a new facility or an expansion of an existing facility in an EJ focus area unless that permit application provides an environmental impact report, which includes cumulative impacts, provides a report to the municipal government, and also organizes a public hearing. So really the intention of this bill is, again, to include a definition of environmental justice, but also to give the state the tools that we need to make sure that we're addressing environmental justice. And I think, especially the conversation around cumulative impacts is incredibly important, because what we see happening currently are polluting facilities end up being sited right next to each other, and that has a really unequal and negative impact on the neighborhoods surrounding those polluting facilities. So this bill, is intended to give the DEM the tools to, be more restrictive with permits and to take into consideration, those environmental burdens. Because as we have LNG facilities, as we have the landfill, there's environmental justice issues in communities around our state. And so this bill is really intended to be able to help the Department of Environmental Management address those issues through the permitting process. And I am happy to answer any questions. Okay. Seeing none, the next bill before us is Senate Bill 473, and Senator DiMario.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman. So this bill, it's a very short bill, very short and simple, but it is an important piece of being able to address the issue of coastal resiliency when it comes to our homes and structures that are in one of our 21 coastal cities and towns. And so what this bill does is it would allow the building inspectors in these 21 coastal cities and towns in Rhode Island to use the tool that the Coastal Resources Management Council has developed, which looks at what the effects of a 7-foot sea level rise and the incidence of a 100-year storm cycle would be in terms of how that would affect potential properties. So when homeowners are looking to have a permit pulled to be able to do some type of building or renovation, they would basically be looking at it through this filter. And so I want to be very clear that this would not be any type of measure that would prevent anybody from proceeding with a plan that they have, but instead it would really create what I think of in medical terms as like an informed consent process of basically just making sure that when people are renovating or building in these areas that are close to the shore but might not be right on the shore, so this might not be top of mind, that they're seeing this through this filter. And so then at that point of renovation or building, they could take advantage of different types of engineering, using different materials, taking advantage of different types of opportunities to maybe build a little bit up off the ground once they have that information in hand about, what could be coming, as we know that the climate continues to change and the sea levels continue to rise. So this is a bill that does have the support of the CRMC. In conjunction with introducing this bill, the CRMC is also reaching out to the building inspectors in all of those cities and towns to educate them about the use of this overlay tool and to talk about this process. So I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone has about this.
Thank you, Senator DiMario. Senator Rogers has a question.
Thank you, Chair. Senator DiMario, where did we come up, the 7 foot, where does that come from? I live up in the high hills, so a lot of times I don't know where these numbers come from, but where did we come up with the 7 foot and why was that number chosen?
Thank you for your question. So if you go onto the CRMC's website, the public actually has the opportunity to look at their Storm Tools tool and to look at that overlay. And so basically this data is the result of a number of scientific projections looking at different levels of potential sea rise over the next XYZ amounts of years. And so basically what this is saying is that, this is allowing the cities and towns to look at that like longest term worst case scenario. There are also tools that allow you to do an overlay for, I believe it's 3 feet, 5 feet, and so on. But so this is based on basically the kind of maximum level of projections that the CRMC has done with this tool. So that's where those numbers come from.
Go ahead, Senator Rogers, with a follow-up.
Just a follow-up, thank you, Chair. So are we talking about possibly, I hear sea rise in half inch, an inch, in 100 years. That's takes a lot of years, by my calculation, to reach a 7 foot sea rise in a couple generations. So I'm just, I was kind of shocked to see a 7 foot overlay number. That would cover a lot of inland ground on a sea rise. I've never heard a sea rising 7 feet, and maybe I'm in the dark on that. But yeah, I was just kind of taken aback by the 7 foot. So thanks.
Thank you, Senator Rogers. And just to add to that discussion, I know that the folks over at the University of Rhode Island and CRMC have been studying the impacts of sea level rise, and there's been actually a lot of conversation that CRMC has actually been a leader on with the help of the folks over at URI and the Coastal Resources Center in studying the projections of sea level rise. So a lot of policy has been developed around the FEMA, the flood maps from FEMA, but FEMA flood maps are backward looking and they don't take into consideration sea level rise projections. So this is an area where the science has, developed to a place where they're able to make very solid projections and an understanding that because of where Rhode Island sits and how the currents in the ocean flow, that we are more susceptible in Rhode Island to increasing sea levels in a way that, we're incredibly vulnerable. So just to add to the discussion. Go ahead, Senator Rogers.
Thank you. And I'm glad we're having this conversation because as I travel around the East Coast, and you kind of you hit it a little bit where it kind of interests me a little bit, because when I think of 7 foot sea rise, I think of from Maine to Florida. And most of us know Florida, there ain't many places that are 10 or 15 feet above the sea level. So, a 7 foot sea rise in Florida, you'd lose half the state. So that's why, does the sea rise equal what we have in Rhode Island, say Cape Hatteras in Florida? To me, water seeks a natural level. So if the sea is going to rise in Portsmouth 7 feet, I'm thinking it would have to rise 7 feet in Miami. Is that not true? I'm not sure.
Right. So, I mean, I think I don't want to botch the science here, and I definitely think that the CRMC and URI tools can help articulate that even further. But I think that there's elements of ocean current as well as natural sinking of land that happens, and that happens differently in Rhode Island based on our natural occurring soil and all of that. So it does actually affect, the sea level rise does actually affect different parts of the coast differently. And Senator Valverde, did you have a question?
No, Senator DiMario answered it in one of her previous responses.
And Senator Archambault, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question, but first and foremost, I apologize for coming on late. May I be counted as present in an affirmative on the other pieces of legislation that were scheduled for consideration, 37 and 155, if there's no objection?
Oh, absolutely, Senator, and I apologize for not recognizing you when you first got on. We were in the midst of discussion.
Yeah, you're so polite. That's me trying to just balance a crazy day while all my friends and colleagues are rolling like a steamroller. So thank you for your warmth. But my question said, Mario, you sound so well informed on this. You've done a lot of work, and that's not flattery. I can just tell you really know the issue. I'm curious as to how at all the coastal resource doctrine interplays with this. That's a federal law, and it affects our coast, and it's applied to any coastline. And I'm just wondering how that interplays with the discussion on the 7 feet, 21 feet, if it conflicts or if it supports. Do you know? If you don't know, maybe they can help us to find out. But go ahead, please.
Sure. Thank you for your question. So I believe that what you're asking is kind of to that point that, this is not necessarily to help people who are already on the coastline, who are like physically kind of right there and know that those are issues that they want to be aware of when building. This is trying to be a little bit more proactive and forward looking in helping people who are a little bit more inland, but still will be affected in the coming years by the sea level rise and by storm surges, to be able to make those informed decisions. So my understanding is that those two things would not be in conflict. This is, again, just kind of that extra level and that extra sort of filter to be able to be looking at things through, to be able to protect property owners from, to be able to help them make a decision at the point of construction or improvement that would potentially head off issues later on.
Thank you. Madam Chair, may I follow up?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So then you explained that well, thanks. So then this is a proactive measure to look at further inward rather than any type of conflict with what exists under the coastal resource doctrine now. Is that fair? That's what I think you said? Because I'm not sure the coastal resource doctrine is a federal law that applies to the coastline and I know you know this, it allows people to have access to our coast. And as a state under the supremacy clause, we can't do anything with that. We own that. I just wonder how this interplays with that, because when we start talking about coastline and moving inward and we stop talking about numbers, I mean, I don't know. I just know that that's a factor to some degree. And I think you explained it well. I'm not trying to beat it to death. I just know that maybe the coastal resource doctrine doesn't extend far enough inward, and this goes further, right? Is that what you're saying? Thank you.
Madam Chair, if I can respond?
Yes, go ahead.
Sure. So, I have been working with the CRMC on this, and that's something that I can definitely go back and check with them on, because I think I understand, sort of the conflict that you're concerned about. And that would definitely be something that we want to make sure, is not in conflict. So I appreciate that.
And just to add as well, thank you, Senator DiMario. And Senator Archambault, that question is well placed. This is actually a concept that has been discussed up and down the coast, actually, and using the example of Florida, there's been a great deal of discussion in Florida about these concepts in particular, as well as North Carolina, and coastal states have been addressing these concerns, and there's a great deal of evolving legal situations as a result of the changing coastline. Senator Rogers.
Sorry for asking questions. Some things pop into my head, and this is knowing when certain insurance companies look at where you're building. For example, on some of the things like Senator Archambault brought up, reflects on cost of insurance. Would this, would the insurance companies be able, even though this is just information they're saying before you build your house, my concern would be where the insurance companies could say, hey, it's been recommended by the CRMC that this could be better building practices, and if you didn't build your house in that manner and it doesn't reflect the same points as Senator Archambault brought up, this could be a runaway train for insurance companies to say, CRMC said this, the state legislature said to put this overlay in, and all of a sudden the insurance companies have got free will to start hitting these people that own these houses with impacts through the insurance policies. I see that happening on something that we're saying is just an informational thing when you build your house, good building practices that you might want to consider. That's a concern that kind of just popped into my head, because I know out in my area, sometimes where you purchase something, you may be considered in a floodplain that was changed after the 2010 floods, and it affects insurance policies, and some insurance policies will not even cover you under that. So, which leaves less insurance companies to cover, and inherently at higher costs. That's just one of my concerns, where this might take a different turn for people to make profits. So, thanks.
And actually, Senator, if I could respond, I think one of the things that's interesting about that point on insurance is that without private insurance coverage, there's actually the federal FEMA flood insurance program. There's been a great deal of discussion over the years about the level of that fund. And again, it's the FEMA flood insurance program. So this is funded by our tax dollars to provide flood protection to homeowners who are developing in coastal areas. And so, one of the things that has been discussed at length around this topic is about the private insurance as well as the FEMA program. And I think one of the things that is a reality of coastal development very frequently is that, folks who are able to afford to buy a coastal home in cash and don't need to get a mortgage won't need to get insurance, because very often when people, they get the mortgage and the mortgage requires them to get the insurance. So they'll be covered in some way by virtue of the mortgage, whereas if they're in a financial position to not need that, but then if they do get, flooded out and their home gets destroyed, we as taxpayers are paying to replace those homes. So I think that that's just an element to consider. And Senator Rogers, before you ask a follow-up question, I do want to see if Senator DiMario wants to respond to this as well.
Chairwoman said exactly what I wanted to say, just around the idea of flood insurance and how that all works, which again, homeowners down here in the coastal areas are well acquainted with, needing to look at things through that lens. And I just did want to just say again that this Storm Tools application is something that is publicly available. Anybody can go in and use it. The intention of this legislation is really more about just being able to get that information out to people at a point that would be critical, where they could potentially make a decision that would save them in the long run.
And
Senator Rogers, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, more of a question, because again, this isn't in my wheelhouse, so I find I have more questions than answers, and that's why this helps me out. So, Chairman, what you said basically is as we get closer to the coast where insurance companies do not cover it, people are allowed to pick it up through basically taxpayer-funded FEMA insurance, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So with that statement, it also leads to me back full circle to my concern. After we do this overlay and we put in best practices where insurance companies could say, sorry, CRMC says you should be doing this, back to the original circle, where we don't, and we won't, and private insurers won't insure that with this information that we're going to put, raising a flag, that would in turn increase the taxpayers' funding if this passes and the insurance companies don't want to cover it. So that means I'm going to have to stop paying more because now the FEMA insurance would have to be picked up by that. So that kind of answered my concern that yes, it is a possibility that'll happen. If I understood it correctly.
Yes, you did. Senator Valverde.
But I think that it would be any extra costs through, FEMA could be balanced out by, avoiding loss of property and loss of tax revenue from, potential flooding and things like that.
Again, if I may, Chair.
Go ahead, Senator Rogers.
I think the point was, I see what you're saying by not building, but this isn't stopping people from building. What I'm trying to say is it opens up an avenue where we put this overlay of what a 7-foot rise would, and that's why I asked where that came from, a 7-foot sea level rise would do to these buildings. And they may not get flooded out, they may not, but it would shift the insurance burden through FEMA by insurance companies not insuring because this information and these houses weren't built to that standard that was recommended. It would shift the cost to the taxpayers through the FEMA insurance being the only thing available. So I kind of exactly put a highlight on my actual concern that this may possibly happen. So that is a concern of mine, and that's why I asked where the 7-foot came from, because to me that sounds pretty alarming. I mean, even 7 foot on Cape Cod, you're going to lose a good chunk of the sandbar by Chatham. So I was always the 7 foot is what hit me, and that leads to me to ask these questions. So I've learned a little bit, and I haven't learned as much as I wanted to, but I have learned some. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rogers. Senator DiMario.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And I appreciate the questions, Senator Rogers. I think two things. One, I just want to direct your attention. I did put a link into the Storm Tools tool that contains some more context around that 7 feet. I also want to be clear that this is also including information, not just about like a permanent state of the ocean being 7 foot further inland, but also that idea of storm surges and, what those things would look like as sea level continues to rise. And so I think that's just an important point to make as well, because those types of things are a little bit sooner. And also, as somebody who previously has worked in the insurance industry, I do just want to make the observation that if the private insurance industry is able to look at a way to defer, costs or liabilities, they are already going to be very well aware of how to do that. And so, again, with this publicly available information, that this isn't anything that's new to them either. Thank you.
Thank you.
Go
ahead, Senator Rogers.
I know. And again, like I said, I revert back to you said that would be not only just 7 foot, but that included the surge of the level. But as I read line 9, it says by 7 foot sea level rise. And then when you talk about surge, I think that's the second part of that line 9 where it says plus 100-year reoccurrence coastal storm. So when I see 100-year reoccurrence coastal storm, I think of the surge on top of the 7 foot sea rise. So that could mean 20 foot. But that's why I was reading that. I was breaking it out. And I was thinking 7 foot, that must mean storm surge, but it doesn't. It clearly states 7 foot sea level rise, and then continues on with reoccurrence, 100-year reoccurrence of coastal storm. So that second part of that sentence to me means the surge on top of the 7 foot. So that's, I don't want to mix words, but that's why I was reading it that way. And when you meant coastal surge, I think that's addressed in the second part of that sentence on top of the 7 foot. So thanks anyway.
Thank you. Are there, Senator Miller?
Yes. So is the purpose of this legislation based on the sea level rise estimates that Senator Rogers pointed out? are slower potentially, but you have also coastal storm and as part of the impact is what we're seeing before rise is accelerated erosion. I mean, and so is part of the purpose to be able to monitor and have the implications of the legislation also go to erosion?
Senator DiMario.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Miller. Yes, that is taken into account. I also just do want to say that we do have Jeff Willis from the CRMC who is going to be available during the public testimony portion to answer questions. So, I'm sure he can clarify some of those issues as well. Thank you.
Are there any further comments or questions? Okay, hearing none, I believe that we are joined by Senator Mendes, and the next legislation is Senate Bill 703. And Senator Mendes, welcome to the committee. And if you would like to go ahead and explain your bill.
Thank you for having me, Chairwoman. Yeah, this bill is actually really simple and interesting. So I'll give you a little bit of background on it just before we kind of dive into it. This is the result of working with Rep. Carson, who has done the lion's share of the work here, and I want to give her the credit for that. We connected over through ECRI on this piece of legislation due to the fact that there was a toxic site in her district in Newport, and in your district as well in Newport, that was being developed, and abutters were very concerned about their ability to be notified about the remediation and the development that was happening. That ExxonMobil owns a lot of property in East Providence, and in our my district and Senator Coyne's district, and some of the community members, I was also hearing from them around, we're a coastal community as well, and what kind of protections were in place for people to be notified when you're living in a coastal community around contaminated sites. So that's a little bit of the background, and I do love that although we are very disconnected in Rhode Island, and this is an East Providence issue, a Newport issue, we're kind of facing something very similar as far as being coastal communities, and the common factor that people really do want to be notified about what is happening in their quote-unquote backyard. So that's the heart of this piece of legislation. Rep. Carson did work with, like I said, we connected through ECRI, but then also DEM as well. And this piece of legislation is quite simple in the fact that it requires that the Department of Environmental Management should take into consideration the threat of rising sea levels when notifying the public and assessing hazardous waste sites and remediation. It creates a platform to communicate with the community and requirements around what it would take to have community meetings as well. One thing I did want to mention was that when contaminated sites are located in an environmental justice focus area, so again, we've already kind of talked about this, so I won't give the definitions. The performing parties, so whoever's doing the remediation and preparing for that site, the ownership is on them and the onus is on them to communicate to the community. And so this expands who the abutters are. It expands the time frame in which people are notified, how they're notified. So it requires signage, public notification, and then in addition to that, if over 15 people have reached out with concerns, it does mandate a community meeting to be facilitated with a certain amount of information provided to them. And so although it seems like a lengthy bill, it's quite simple. It's something that I think we can all agree on, is that when there's contamination and toxins in your community, our constituents should be obliged to be informed about what's happening in their backyard regarding remediation and toxic and contaminated sites, and are eager to be informed about those things. So the more that we can facilitate that kind of transparency, the better. And what better department to do that through than the Department of Environmental Management? And that is kind of the heart of the bill. I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Senator Mendes. Are there any questions for the bill sponsor? Senator Rogers, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Senator Mendes. The question is, I shoot through the bill and look it down. It does sound good, but to me, the way I read it, it looks like it's only specific for certain areas.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I'm actually glad you picked up on that. I am actually. Common knowledge, I'm not a fan of incrementalism or very small bills or half measures. So I like big, robust things that address a lot of people. But this is particular to coastal communities. And the reason why it's very specific is because, as we were been talking about through this entire committee meeting, those are the people that are at threat. And so when you live in a coastal community, as people in Newport and East Providence know, when hurricanes hit, they hit us hard. And so if you have toxic sites, contaminated sites that are in the middle of being remediated, and it's September and there's a hurricane coming, those people want to know what's going to be carried into their backyard and in the winds and in the air. And so that's why it's addressing these particular areas up front, is because they're the ones that are at most at risk right now, while we are looking at a climate crisis where there's extreme weather patterns. But I agree and would be eager and excited to see this being mandated, statewide. But yeah, that's why the focal area is specific.
I think if I may.
Go ahead, Senator Rogers.
I'd like to have this, and I apologize, I really do, but I know it's a short bill tonight, short thing tonight, but there's a couple things on it, and as I read them, like I had mentioned, you got line 11.2 environmental justice focus areas, so it looks like it's almost specific to certain people in other communities that may not fall into that paraphrase are being treated unequal and undifferently. So I hate to use the word, but the bill seems like it's almost trying to be equitable to only one certain group more than another. So to me, and I know we preach equity, but this actually is putting that in reverse and turning it on its head. Where from this, 50 groups that are in the highest 15% census block groups, Rhode Island, with respect to a percent of population identified as racial minorities, or the highest 15% of Rhode Island census block groups with respect to population identified as being twice the poverty level. So this bill, it's not treating Bel Air and Newport the same, and it's funny how you mentioned Newport, as it would be on off of Eddy Street by that area. So it almost looks like it's treating one group of people different than the other, and I find that concerning. If we're going to push things on equity, it should be fair across the board. So I just, that's what's glaring to me on that. So I find it odd that section was put in there with, I thought, cleanup areas are cleanup areas. Doesn't matter if it's my wealthy grandmother or my poor children living in it. Cleanup is cleanup, and this seems to kind of put a dollar amount on where and a poverty amount on where it's going to be addressed. So I find that odd.
Go ahead,
Chairwoman, if I may.
Yep, go ahead, Senator Mendes.
Yeah, so there are a couple of really important things to know here, Senator Rogers. So, for example, coastal zone and environmental justice focus areas are talking about its risk. So we're not choosing people over people. These are the high risk areas. People that are in the coastal communities are high risk areas. The census block is identifying a risk area. And so if these are people that are most at risk, then they should be notified. And I am agreeing with you that notification and transparency is something that we should fight for and champion for everyone. But what this bill is trying to do is focusing in on those that are in high risk, and those in the coastal communities, as in Newport and in my community in East Providence, as well as those that are identified by the United States Census block as in risk are identified in this bill. It's not either or, it is and.
So
go ahead, Senator Rogers.
You do agree that this bill is focusing on, your words, not mine, on a certain group of people and not for all equally.
I agree that coastal zones are what they are, defined in this page 2, which is defined in length, and also environmental justice focus areas. And the reason why those are there is due to the risk outlined by those. Yeah, and and that is the intention of this bill. So yeah, it's pretty clear.
Thank you, Senator Mendes.
I don't know how else to explain risk. Go ahead.
Thank you, Senator Mendes. And Senator Miller, you had a comment or a question?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of my district and covering part of Allen's Avenue and Eddy Street, where there has been those kind of challenges, and there has been important input because there was hearings around the LNG projects and other projects in that area that have, you know, a lot of risk for the community. But I paused to have a similar concern to Senator Rogers, but the demographics of like the Cranston population that is very concerned because of geography rather than demographics. Would this legislation enhance a community that wants to support the work or the concerns of a community adjacent where the demographics would qualify them to be notified? But they're like next door communities where the demographic, like the Cranston part of that shoreline community, probably wouldn't qualify on the 15%, but a few blocks away, the Providence community in that same shoreline would qualify under this notification. So would they still both be able to collaborate and support and represent the same concerns?
Yeah, I believe that they would, and also it would, you know, by definition of the coastal zone as well, I believe that they would. And then it also gives room that if 15 people were to kind of reach out and say they wanted a community, you know, a community meeting, that they'd be obliged to that. And then that would put the person, the people that were developing it, the person that is developing and or looking to remediate or do anything to this contaminated site, to reach out to all those abutters from that area. So that's the focal point. The obligation is on those that are doing the remediation or touching that contaminated site. So if that contaminated site falls, you know, if someone is living within that area, then they're contacted and they're considered part of community. As we know, community doesn't always respect district lines. It doesn't always respect, you know, community is community. And so when they call that community meeting, by all means, yes. Senator Rogers. Chairwoman probably should say that.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Senator Rogers.
I just want to be clear when I make this statement. When I read this bill, I actually see social injustice written into this bill. That's clearly how I read it. And I don't want to parse words with it. I just want to be clear and on the record that that's what I am reading in this bill. Complete social injustice. Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments for Senator Mendes? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Senator, for joining the committee. And
thank you. I think you should be hearing from some members of ECRI and I believe the DEM as well later in public testimony if they are logged on. I do have another committee meeting to hop off and onto, and but thank you so much for your time. And I do want to just make it really clear, you know, the reason I do have a certain kind of flavor and wheelhouse of bills that I sign on to or that I sponsor, but I felt like this one was really important because it did, you know, it doesn't address the climate crisis that I know that we are all facing in the robust, big way that I prefer to kind of like tackle those things. But what it does do is communicate and increase communication with the community. And if there's any way that we can kind of continue to facilitate communicating with the community about what's happening in their backyard, we should do that. And so, yeah, I'm hoping that we can move forward with this bill and all other efforts to do that.
thank you, Senator. And with that, we are going to move to public testimony. And I believe we should, we're going to actually start with public testimony on Senate Bill 473, Senator DiMario's bill. And I believe we should be joined by Jeff Willis of the CRMC. And Jeff, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
And thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am not sure if you were able to follow our discussion earlier. The committee had a very robust discussion about Senate Bill 473, but you can go ahead and give your testimony, and I believe that there may be some committee members who have questions for you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I was able to listen to several of the questions that were raised. And I actually appreciate, Madam Chair, your responses and Senator DiMario's responses. They were spot on in trying to answer some questions. But if I may go into some more detail along those lines, maybe I can further explain some of the issues. The 7-foot plus 100-year return storm shouldn't really be seen as a height issue, but more of an aerial extent issue. And it's looking to have from a planning perspective, where in the community might sea level rise and storms have an impact to structures. And so that's where the 7-foot extent came from. It was derived from the NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration's calculations on sea level rise over the next 100 years. So if that better explains where the 7-foot came from, it's more of an aerial extent to look at impacts from from the activities that are within that area from sea level rise and storm surge. And I also heard that this tool, this coastal hazards analysis tool, is more of a forward-thinking document, and it is. The FEMA maps are not forward-thinking, as I believe Senator DiMario mentioned. They are looking at issues that occurred up to a point in time. What we have tried to do with our university partners is look forward based on what those sea level rise projections could be. And so we thought it was a very good exercise to make folks aware that if they are contemplating additions, expansions, or new structures within this aerial extent, this flooding extent area, that they should look to the future to see where sea level rise might occur on their property in the future. And the example that we've used over time has been someone who wants to build a house today and has a 30-year mortgage. Where in 30 years might sea level rise be at the end of that mortgage or before the end of the 30-year mortgage term? And in the year 2050, we anticipate that sea level rise will be about 3 feet from today. So it is possible that at the end of that mortgage period, the water could be lapping at the door of that particular structure. And if we hadn't had the foresight to think about where the water levels might be at a certain point in time, then we would be in these situations that I just explained. But if we can have people look at where the expected water levels might be at the end of the design life of whatever they're proposing, they can plan for that. They can plan to maybe raise the structure higher in elevation. They could plan to have the structure moved further away from the flooding extent. And those are the issues that we're trying to get folks to understand. I think also what was brought up as an issue were that, yes, this is not a regulatory stance of the agency. It's an awareness stance because the FEMA flood maps are the regulatory tool that the building officials have to use. So if someone has plans to develop their property today, they would be bound by the regulations in effect at the local building level using FEMA flood maps to make their calculations. What we are asking folks to do in these flood areas is look to the future and maybe plan for the future by being aware that at a particular point in time, the flooding issues may be on their property and they might want to account for it through this tool. So I think those are the things that I heard in the questions that I just wanted to go into some further detail. And then one more, I'm sorry, on the insurance part of it, we already know right now that when homes are elevated or moved further away from harm's way, that the FEMA insurance premiums go down. So we also do know that some premiums, because of the where the activity on the property is located could be in the tens of thousands of dollars per year for flood insurance. And if they raise the structure 1 foot above flood elevation or more, that premium goes down significantly to well into the low thousands, maybe even hundreds of dollars per year. So there is the incentive to look to the future to see how they can minimize impacts and mitigate and make their property more resilient. Happy to answer any questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And we do have a question from Senator Rogers. Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you. 2 points. So, from what I'm understanding is because it's not a federal regulatory thing, the insurance companies can't use it as their information to raise rates. I think I was hearing that. And then I'll follow up my next question. Is that's what you're saying? So the insurance companies wouldn't be able to raise their rates on this because it doesn't, it's not tied into the federal lines of flood maps, correct?
Senator, for private insurance, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if they can unilaterally make that decision based on the information that's out there. But for FEMA purposes, FEMA has their insurance rates right now for those that are using the FEMA flood insurance program, and the premiums do go down when property owners mitigate for it, and that mitigation or resiliency being elevation or moving structures back.
Well, again, back to my concern is by doing this, shining a light on it, giving private insurance companies the ability to do that would shift more people from being able to be privately insured into the FEMA insurance, which is funded partially by taxpayer funding. So that question hasn't been answered. We can all agree on that. And the second question that I was going to ask is this going to be implemented through the local municipalities' GIS mapping systems through the building officials on the GSI systems? I'm assuming that's how it's going to be done.
The mechanics would be handled town by town, but so what we're trying to do is work with the 21 coastal communities in the areas that are beyond the CRMC's regulatory jurisdiction, which is 200 feet from a coastal feature. Because for new construction and certain types of significant construction activities, we do require folks to go through this exercise, yet they're still only bound by the local building codes in that community. So to implement this beyond the CRMC's jurisdiction would still be through the local building official, the planning office, if you will, and in an awareness capacity, because the current regulations would still be the regulations that the property owner would be bound to.
Well, I guess that leads back to probably, I'm probably dead on the question. The only ability to do that would be locally would be through their elevations. The 7-foot rise is going to elevation rise on land would probably more likely be done through their GIS systems, and that's how they're going to do it. It would be mapping in their GIS systems, and this is going to be, will this be a cost effect on the municipalities to have that additional work done through the mapping system on their GIS mappings? There's just I don't know if it's a funded mandate that they would have to cost them money to do to get this mapping system in play that shows which houses fall within the elevations of that 7-foot rise or 100-foot storm surge. It has to be delineated, so I'm sure some work has to be done. I was just wondering what that cost would be, if any, to implement that. I'm assuming through their GIS mapping systems, which most communities are. I know the town of Forest is still in the dark ages, and we're just starting to get into our GIS mappings. So that was just a question of a cost, or will it be a cost to get it done?
If I may, Madam Chair, the parcel data exists in most of the 21 coastal communities, and the storm tools that we help develop with the university can overlay that information currently on any GIS system that a municipality has. So it shouldn't be a cost issue to any of them. That information already exists. It's just I guess a software tool, if you will, to build a project in the GIS program.
Are there any further questions or comments for this witness? Okay, I don't see any. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeff.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And that actually concludes the witness list for Senate Bill 473. There's no written testimony that we have in the record as of yet. And so we're moving on to Senate Bill 105, and I believe we have Terry Gray from the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management on the phone. And Terry, welcome to the committee if you want to go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman. Members of the committee, good afternoon. And thank you for providing DEM with the opportunity to comment on Senate Bill 105. My name is Terry Gray. I'm the Deputy Director for Environmental Protection for DEM, and my responsibilities include the regulatory programs, clean water, waste management, and the cleanup of contaminated sites. And by regulatory authorities, that includes permitting, compliance, enforcement, as well as a lot of policy development as well. As you know, Senate Bill 105 would establish new permit requirements for projects located in environmental justice areas. And I just want to start out by saying DEM strongly supports efforts to more proactively address environmental justice by state government. And we hope to be a leader in that area. Environmental justice refers to the fair treatment and meaningful involvement for all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. And for our programs, that really plays in with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. As you know, throughout Rhode Island's history, certain populations and areas of the state have been subject to disproportionate amounts of pollution. And those conditions still exist in many areas in Rhode Island. They have, additionally, a lot of those same communities have not had equal access to the benefits that we provide from our environmental programs and other state programs. And as a whole, DEM is committed to finding solutions that will consider these past issues and injustices and ensure that all residents of Rhode Island benefit from a clean and healthy environment. When you're looking at promoting environmental justice, it really requires that state government work closely with the residents of impacted communities. We've had an ongoing dialogue with residents in the Washington Park and South Providence community, for one, dealing with port issues. We've also had very active dialogue with the communities in Newport, dealing with the Restoration Advisory Board issues related to the Naval Education and Training Center. There are other examples of this across the state, and those just touch on what needs to be done. The Senate 105 presents a lot of really useful concepts to move forward to provide better opportunities and enhanced opportunities for public participation. And it also requires the cumulative impacts be considered. So often our programs look at individual impacts. So it's an exposure to a water pollutant. It's an exposure to an air pollutant. It's an exposure to a pollutant in soil. And they're all considered individually and in silos, when in fact those exposures can have a greater impact taken together when we look at them cumulatively. There's a lot of science and policy that needs to go into developing that, and then incorporating into our permit reviews and our decision-making processes. And all of that has important implications on public health as well as environmental quality. And it has real implications for community support for the really kind of the coherence and credibility of the review process on those permit applications as well. The last thing that I'd like to throw out there is there's a lot of work involved in doing environmental justice right. And I already mentioned some of the policy and regulatory complications that are really critical in making this happen. But there's also a lot of work that needs to go into this in terms of building trust and building capacity with local communities to really participate effectively in a lot of the processes we're talking about. So, I guess in conclusion, again, I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to testify. I really want to thank you for raising the issues of environmental justice and to really emphasize that DEM wants to be a leader in this. and look forward to answering any questions that you have and working through some of the policy implications that would come from implementing Senate Bill 105. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Terry. Does anyone have any questions or comments for this witness? Okay, I don't see any. Thank you so much, Terry, for joining us.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Have a good day.
You too.
Goodbye.
And we should be joined by our next witness, David Valise from the Rhode Island Sierra Club. And I believe David is testifying on 2 bills in front of us tonight. David, welcome to the committee, and if you want to go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you very much, Chairperson and members of the committee. My name is David Valise. I am the Vice Chair of the Rhode Island Sierra Club, as well as the Environmental Justice Chair. I'm here tonight to support Senate Bill 105 and Senate Bill 703 that create environmental justice zones around the state and help prevent the construction or expansion of polluting facilities in already overburdened communities. The creation of environmental justice zones and environmental justice focused areas will put more power in the hands of community members in getting to decide what happens in their own neighborhoods. Low-income and communities of color have been disproportionately impacted by environmental toxins due to a racist history of toxic facilities being built in and polluting these communities. Our society has stood by for a long time while Black and brown communities suffered from environmental hazards such as elevated asthma rates, lead poisoning, as well as mental and emotional trauma. Sometimes we don't think about that living in a society where decision makers think that it's okay for you to live in preventable health hazards and that it's okay for your community to be less clean and less healthy than their own is traumatic. Why is it okay for our communities to suffer more? It shouldn't be, because it's not. So we need to change that. Putting preventative steps to protect communities and accountability and transparency measures will help to curb some of the inequality. We have a long way to go to fix it, but at least we can stop further damage, and we hope that this is just the beginning and that more legislations like this pass. As an environmental justice activist for more than 20 years, and as a resident of Rhode Island, I thank Senator Euer and Senator Mendez for introducing these legislations. And I thank you all for listening to me rant and supporting these legislation. Have a good night.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions or comments for this witness? I don't see any. Thank you so much for your testimony and for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And I just want to hold for just a minute. I'm understanding we have a slight technical difficulty that I want to make sure gets resolved before we continue the hearing. So if the committee members can just hold on for a moment so we can try to fix some streaming issue. Thank you, committee members and members of the public for your patience. I believe the issue should have been fixed. Some wire got crossed and we were streaming visually and for some reason Labor co-opted our audio channel. So I believe that we are back. I'll have some words with Chair Coyne over that. But I believe we are ready to move forward and we should have our next witness on the phone. We should have Hank Webster. And Hank, if you're there, if you want to let us know who you're testifying on behalf of today and what legislation you're going to speak to, and you can go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Euer. My name is Hank Webster, and I'm the Rhode Island Director of Acadia Center. Sorry, I'm picking up a little bit of echo. I'm here to testify on behalf of, in support of S-105. I'm sorry. Hello?
We can hear you. We can hear you, Hank. I don't know if you have the audio in the background, but you can turn it down in the background.
No, I do not have it. I'm hearing it through the phone, but I'll proceed. I'll soldier through if it's not bothering you.
Yeah, we don't hear it at all on our side, so.
Then I'll just go through. Thank you. So I just wanted to testify on behalf of Acadia Center. We're a clean energy research and advocacy organization that operates throughout the Northeast, working to advance the clean energy future. And I wanted to testify in support of S-105. This is a very important bill, as previous witnesses have noted. Communities of color, indigenous communities, low-income, lower English proficiency communities are often marginalized from siting decisions and often have to suffer the effects of overwhelming amounts of pollution. And I really appreciate the bill's attention to the cumulative impacts because oftentimes through state government processes, not only in Rhode Island, but regionally and nationally, we look at the impacts from a individual project in a silo rather than recognizing the whole picture and really the overwhelming amount of pollution that's being foisted upon communities. If I could make one recommendation, it would be to also explicitly identify transportation infrastructure as another type of facility that I think falls under some of these criteria. As we know through air quality monitoring, that highways and bus and train depots and ports and other types of transportation infrastructure can often be investment decisions that the state or local governments make that bring along significant amounts of fossil fuel combustion that just layers on top of other types of pollution that are on the scene from things like fossil fuel power generation plants, landfills, and all the other types of facilities listed in the definitions. And as we know, transportation pollution is actually the #1 source of air pollution in our state, accounting for nearly 40% of the total from fossil fuel-related transportation uses. So, again, just wanted to state my support for this bill. Appreciate all of the effort that's gone into it and the focus on making sure that we are taking into account the full impacts of investment decisions on communities that are least able to voice their opinions on it. I'd be happy to answer any question that the committee may have.
Thank you, Hank. Are there any questions for this witness? I don't see any. Thank you so much for joining us, Hank.
Thank you, Chair.
If the committee can just hang tight for a second, the audio issue that I described actually hasn't yet been resolved, so I'm going to take another stab at getting that fixed before we continue. And just so the committee members know as well, we only have 3 more witnesses signed up for tonight, so I think timing-wise we're in good shape. So want to make sure that we can get this audio resolved so that the public can see the live stream. Test, 1, 2. Okay, the committee members, I'm not sure, want to make sure that the committee members have time to rejoin the committee. As I mentioned, we had a bit of a technical issue. I believe it is resolved. And so we should be able to move on to our final couple witnesses. Thank you, committee members and members of the public, for your patience. And with that, I believe we should be joined by Andrew Coyne. And Andrew, if you're on with us, welcome to the committee. You can go ahead, let us know. I believe you're testifying on 2 bills, so go ahead and let us know what bills you're testifying, if you're representing any organizations, and you can go ahead with your testimony.
Hi, Madam Chair and the members of the committee. I am calling in support of Senate Bills 105 and 703. I'm calling on behalf of myself. I have been a part of the fight against the LNG facility and as well as other polluting facilities in the Port of Providence and along Allen's Ave. I'd like to note that the number one factor in someone's health is their zip code. That's why these bills are important. Someone's zip code is the most likely determinant of how clean or polluted their air, water, housing, and land is. And in Providence in particular, we have some of the highest asthma rates in the country, and especially in the region. And this is caused from the pollution along the port and along Allen's Ave. There are several things that I noticed in the bill that I had some comments on, that if possible I would like to see if they could be addressed. If in the part about the section about hearings, I was hoping that one of the hearings that we had for the LNG facility was at a police station, and I would like to make sure that hearings are not held at police stations. We shouldn't be having hearings at police stations for various reasons. I won't get into that now unless people on the committee have further questions about that. Advertising, and for the public notice, it talks about advertising in languages other than English, and it talks about it being in a newspaper that's circulated throughout the state. I would like to recommend that it's in a newspaper that is written in that language. If you go in any neighborhood community store that is for a specific community, there'll often be a newspaper there that is in that language, and that would be a better way to reach the community than in, say, the Providence Journal, and just having it be translated in that language. Then one of the issues that we sometimes come across is a facility, the way that the census blocks are drawn is how the environmental justice communities are defined. And so in certain cases, we will have a facility that is proposed just outside of the environmental justice community, but the vast majority of the impacts are impacting that environmental justice community. So if there is a way to adjust the language in the legislation to make sure that if the majority of the impacts are going to impact that community, I don't know if it has to be written like in length, in a distance, or what, but if it could be written so that if a facility is going to impact the environmental justice community, it needs to go through this process, and not just if it's in the community. One of the other concerns I have is most of the permits have specific, if a project is going through multiple permits, usually one of the permits is more into the subject matter that it's likely that we could stop the project with that permit. So I'm a little concerned about how the applicant would only have to go through this process once, and how that could potentially be used, that they might try that on the permit that's the easiest for them to get, like, say, a stormwater permit. So I would just want to make sure that that section of the regulation, the law, is not used in that manner. And who is considered community? At the hearings that I've been to, everyone is opposed to it, and then occasionally there'll be some lobbyists that show up, either from various lobbyist organizations may show up on behalf of business interest, and I just wanted to make sure that, like, a lobbyist would not be considered a part of the community if they're showing support for a project that the community is opposed to. It specifically mentions notifying a
Andrew, I think the phone is cutting out a little bit, so I'm not sure if you've changed locations, but we definitely have lost your audio.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yep, you're back now.
Where did I leave off that you were able to hear last? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. You can go ahead.
Okay. So one of the other concerns that I had is in Bill 105, it does not discuss renewal of permits. And one of the permits that we tried fighting against was the renewal of the permit for Shell along Allen's Ave, which was a renewal of air permits. And so without putting that in there, it's basically going to allow these polluting facilities to continue to pollute for the foreseeable future. And so while these bills are good, I really hope that the committee moves forward with also approving the Green Justice Zone bill, which had zero opposition and significant testimony in favor of. So thank you. That's all of my comments.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions or comments for this witness? I don't see any. Thank you so much, Andrew, for your testimony.
Thank you.
And I believe we should be joined now by Meg Kerr from the Audubon Society of Rhode Island. And Meg, thank you for joining us. If you want to go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you very much, Chair, members of the committee. My name is Meg Kerr, and I'm the Director of Policy at the Audubon Society. I'm here testifying in support of Senate Bill 105, the Environmental Justice Bill. But I also wanted to say that we also support Senate 473 and Senate 703, although I didn't submit written testimony in support of those. On the topic of environmental justice, I have spoken to the committee in the past about the new strategic plan that we have at Audubon. It was developed during the pandemic, signed into by our board in June, and it directs our work through 2025. And that plan directs us to focus all of our work on the climate crisis and environmental justice. So we're really pleased to see bills before you now looking at environmental justice and really support getting environmental justice, a definition of it in statute. I think that's all a really important step. We have just a couple of comments on the bill. I haven't been able to listen to the testimony before me, so my apologies if I'm repeating what things people have already said. One thing is that I think that when we're thinking about what people in environmental justice communities are exposed to, there are a lot of legacy pollutants from industrial activities in the past that are a problem. Superfund sites, brownfields, abandoned landfills, sites that continue to leach toxic materials. And I think looking at the cumulative impacts needs to look at those legacy pollutants as well. And And to that same note, I think we need to look at facilities that are now closed. There can be facilities that are had been polluting in the past and are now closed but are still problematic. I would encourage, when you're asking for a list of environmental justice areas, to request that it be more than a list, include a map and data, so that you all and the public can understand where these areas are and what data are used to define them. And then my last comment is that I think the bill does a good job thinking about DEM programs, but there are also regulatory programs at CRMC, and that might be something that this bill or a future bill might want to consider when we're thinking about looking at permits through an environmental justice lens. So thank you very much for the opportunity to comment, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Meg. Are there any questions or comments for this witness? All right, Meg, I don't see any. Thank you so much for calling in today. And I believe that's the last witness for Senate Bill 105. Before we move on to our next caller for Senate Bill 703, I did want to make sure I drew the committee's attention to the written testimony. We do have a letter from National Grid who submitted comments, and we have a letter from the ACLU in support. We have a letter from the Nature Conservancy in support, and we have a letter from the Rhode Island Business Coalition against. And so with that, we'll move on to the testimony for Senate Bill 703, and I believe we should have Dr. Peter Trafton on the phone with us. And are you there?
Yes, indeed. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. If you want to go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Euer and committee members. I'm Dr. Peter Trafton of Providence, a retired trauma surgeon with a long-standing interest in public health. I'm speaking for myself. Thanks so very much for your work on many aspects of Rhode Island's environmental efforts and for the opportunity to testify today in favor of Senator Mendes' Bill 703. I'm here to emphasize how important I believe it is for our state to address the issues of climate and environmental justice. The COVID pandemic shows clearly that while we were all impacted, disadvantaged minority groups and neighborhoods were hurt first and worst. But long before COVID, the public health inequities of areas like the Port of Providence and adjacent to Interstate 95 were present, but really not very well recognized at all. The same is true for the growing impacts of climate crisis worldwide and in Rhode Island. It's the underserved and overburdened who are going to bear the brunt of it. Privileged Rhode Islanders like me must work for our less fortunate neighbors to correct the inequities inherent in our political and social systems. Here in Providence, we have wonderful examples of environmental justice at work. One of their most important features is the extent of community involvement and influence. S703 emphasizes alerting residents to local toxic hazards and getting meaningful participation by local residents in the prevention and correction of environmental harm to both environmental justice focus areas and coastal zones. These are the individuals who live there. They're the most affected by harmful pollution and sea level rise, including storm surges, and they're the ones with the greatest stake in just and effective solutions. S703 improves communications between the owners of environmental risks and the people who stand in harm's way. Please help us pass this bill. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Do any members of the committee have any questions or comments for this witness? Okay, I don't see any. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
And I believe we should be joined by our next witness, who is Brian Moran. Brian, if you want to go ahead and let us know what organization you're with, and you can go ahead with your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Brian Moran, and I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the New England Convenience Store and Energy Marketers Association. We represent convenience stores and gasoline retailers, fuel distributors, and the businesses which supply them. In Rhode Island, there are about 500 convenience stores in the state. We have submitted written comments opposing Senate Bill 703, and what I'd like to do is identify a couple of comments we have from the perspective of a performing party. And I think that is lacking in this bill, as well as the practical realities of some of these requirements as well. One, I would echo Senator Rogers' comments earlier in the hearing about this bill, and I was confused as well about, kind of parsing out the coastal zone and trying to find a nexus in my own mind about how those requirements are necessary and even apply. In terms of the bill, I would also encourage that these areas appear to be very specifically identified and that these should become mapped and be part of an exhibit of this legislation so that everybody can see the impacts. That's number one. Number two, comment concerns a statement within the document, which I think is reflective of a lack of a perspective of a performing party, is that it says the best public involvement is one that is a two-way process that benefits both the public and the agency. And in fact, based on experience, it's a three-legged stool where the community and the residents participate, the agency has its role to enforce the rules, and the performing parties implement it. And all three need to be on the same page. And I think that perspective needs to be brought to this legislation. We're deeply concerned that some of the requirements, particularly for performing parties, are overly broad. And I could point to an example where a performing party or a person conducting a due diligence investigation to obtain financing would be considered as a voluntary or another performing party under the bill. And to fulfill, you'd have to comply with these new public notice requirements. I don't think I need to tell a lot of people, but that certainly would have a negative and chilling effect on all real estate transactions across the state. The next trigger is that it appears that the director is going to decide when and where and how these requirements are implemented, at which sites. And, no disrespect to the director at all, but I think the legislation really needs to identify specific criteria for when these requirements will or will not apply. And, it needs to be objective criteria that make sense. Another major concern we have is the posting of 4-foot by 6-foot signs in these coastal areas or an EJ area. They're very problematic to do that. As soon as you put up a sign, it's going to create an immediate and lasting public stigma on the property, leading to immediate devaluation of that property and others in the immediate area. It's, in essence, a scarlet letter approach that's punitive, and it'll likely be met with resistance by property owners impacted by a release not of their own making, as one example. Meaning, how will multiple properties that may underlie a contaminant or groundwater plume that runs below multiple homes or buildings, how will that work? What happens when the performing party wants to implement the cleanup or investigation and the property owner won't grant access or the property owner won't let them put up the sign? What happens then? And in general, our experience is signs don't promote public involvement. If signs remain part of this legislation, then we definitely need to have specific criteria of when they're required and when they're not. Another requirement that's incredibly ambitious and onerous is a requirement to notify all property owners, tenants, easement holders within 2,500 feet. So a half-mile radius around the site, you're going to have to research hundreds, if not thousands, of property deeds. You have to try and track down and get cooperation of the building owner to find out who the tenants are and mail them a letter with all information. And it may be for something they totally don't even care about because it's a half mile away from them. I think the intent here is, current requirements allow at the beginning of the investigative process to provide notice to abutters, people directly next to the site. To expand it to a half mile is really, I haven't seen it in any other state. And another key piece with that 2,500 foot radius is, where do you measure it from? Is it from the source, or is it from where the contamination is located? And how will that get updated? And how will that work? So there's a lot of issues with this bill that need the perspective of a performing party to identify, meaningful and balanced and pragmatic opportunities for people to participate in this entire cleanup process, whether they are in an EJ community or a coastal area or in the highlands of Rhode Island. And in essence, I think those distinctions are very important, and these requirements, need a lot more work in a nutshell. Be happy to answer any questions if the committee has any.
Thank you. And Senator Rogers has a question for you.
Not so much a question, but a statement. We talk about Highlands and East Greenwich and all these different areas, and I just like to add, in my neighborhood, we provide the water source for 60% of the people drinking in the state of Rhode Island. I can remember, and it probably wouldn't happen as much as it does out here. There are times, I don't know if you guys remember Pachillas Pig Farm, a few miles from my house, at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, we had 55-gallon drums exploding 100, 150 feet in the air and catching the woods on fire. So, I mean, there is areas all around that raise concerns, and I just feel we should all be treated fairly. And I know this has to do with the coastal area, but again, my sentiment on how the bill was written, it's pretty concerning to me. I don't have to redo that, but thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rogers. Are there any other comments or questions for this witness? Okay, I don't see any. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Brian.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
And this does conclude the public testimony on Senate Bill 703. In addition to the verbal testimony that we've received, we also do have a letter from Jordan Goyette, who actually is in support of Senate 105 and Senate 703, and also National Grid did submit comments on 703. So with that, I do believe that concludes the business that our committee has before us tonight. And with that, I would entertain a motion of adjournment.
So moved.
Moved by Senator DiMario. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.